Have you ever noticed that two people can experience the exact same reality and yet create completely different lives from it? One sees possibility, the other sees limitation. One moves with certainty, the other hesitates in doubt. One creates momentum and the other stays trapped in fear. According to both Napoleon Hill and the teachings of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, the difference is not reality itself, it's belief. David, William, Pearce, welcome back. And this week we're continuing through chapter 2 of Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. This chapter is all about faith, but I want to explore it through the lens of non-dual Shaiva Tantra, because the deeper I study both systems, the more I keep finding the same truths expressed through different language. Not just about wealth, but about consciousness itself. And so by the end of this video, I want you to understand not only what Napoleon Hill meant by faith, but how to actually begin applying it practically in your own life. Napoleon Hill says, faith is the head chemist of the mind. And that line is fascinating because he isn't talking about blind religious belief. He's talking about a state of consciousness that conditions perception, behavior, emotion, and action. A state of mind that literally reorganizes your experience of reality. And Tantra would agree. In non-dual Shaiva Tantra, consciousness is not separate from reality. Consciousness is reality. The universe itself is understood as consciousness vibrating into form, which means your thoughts, your beliefs, your emotions, your identity, they're not passive observations of life, they are participatory forces within it. Hill says that thoughts mixed with emotion and faith begin translating themselves into their physical equivalent. Tantra says something similar. Whatever consciousness consistently identifies with begins crystallizing into lived experience. In Sanskrit, there is the concept of samskara, conditioned grooves within consciousness. Repeated thoughts strengthen identity. Repeated emotional states strengthen perception. And repeated beliefs begin filtering what reality itself appears to be. And eventually, you stop seeing life clearly. You start seeing through conditioning. This is why two people can enter the same relationship and one experiences intimacy while the other experiences fear. One experiences possibility while the other experiences rejection. Not because reality itself has changed, but because their belief is different. Hill says the subconscious mind makes no distinction between constructive and destructive thought impulses. And that's profound because most people unknowingly hypnotize themselves every day. I'm not enough. This never works. I always fail. I can't do it. Whatever story sounds familiar to you, repeated long enough with emotional intensity, the nervous system begins accepting those thoughts as truth. This is Joe Dispenza's work, and life begins organizing itself around them. And as Dispenza says, you need to break free of the habit of yourself, create a new personality to create a new personal reality. This is why Hill places so much emphasis, I think God agreed, on auto-suggestion and repetition. Not because repetition magically manifests things, but because repetition conditions consciousness. And Tantra understands this too. Your identity is not fixed. Your ego is reinforced through repetition. The thoughts you consistently energize, the emotions you repeatedly embody, and the stories that you rehearse internally. Eventually, they all become the atmosphere of your life. Napoleon Hill says that one comes finally to believe whatever one repeats to oneself, whether the statement be true or false. And honestly, that should give us pause for thought. because it means many people are unconsciously training themselves into their suffering. Joe Dispenza would likely agree. But this chapter is not simply about thinking positively. It's too shallow to consider it that way, because Hill is pointing towards something deeper. Faith is emotionalized certainty, a state where thought, emotion, identity, and expectation become coherent, and Tantra would call this integration. Head, heart, body, and action moving in the same direction, because one of the biggest drains on human energy is internal contradiction. Saying, I want success, whilst unconsciously believing that you're unsafe with visibility. Saying that you want intimacy, whilst internally expecting abandonment. Saying that you desire wealth, whilst carrying guilt around receiving. The conscious mind desires one thing, the conditioned nervous system believes another, and people wonder why they remain stuck. Hill says that faith can be developed through repeated autosuggestion. And I think this is important to understand properly, because he's not saying lie to yourself. He's saying condition yourself internally instead of unconsciously. Most people are already auto-suggesting. They're just doing it negatively, repeating fear, limitation, reinforcing doubt and inadequacy. Tantra would call this unconscious mantra, perhaps. The mind repeating the same vibration until identity forms around it, and your reality becomes a reflection of it. So how do we apply this understanding practically to create change? Well, first we need to become aware of the thought that is being repeatedly energized emotionally. Not occasionally, but repeatedly. Because repetition becomes identity. And when we can recognize what it is that we're doing and bring a conscious awareness to it, it's the opportunity to step out of it. Second is to recognize that emotion amplifies thought. Hill specifically says that faith, love, and sex are amongst the most powerful emotional energies because they energize consciousness intensely. Tantra would say that these states where consciousness becomes highly charged and therefore highly creative, meaning that what you repeatedly feel matters a lot, is important. Third is to begin consciously rehearsing the version of yourself you actually want to become. This is a big part of Joe Dispenza's work as well. Not fantasizing, but embodying. Hill's self-confidence formula is essentially identity conditioning, repeatedly holding a vision of who you are becoming until your nervous system stops treating it as foreign. And I think that can be the challenge, right? We want to embody this new version of ourselves and we repeat who we're endeavoring to become, but we don't see immediate change, and so we lose faith. But if we can continue doing the practice, you will inevitably see change. And this is where most people quit, because initially the old conditioning pushes back. The old identity resists. Fear appears. Doubt presents itself. Disbelief and embarrassment. But Hill says perfection comes through practice. And unsurprisingly, Tantra agrees. Transformation is repetition. Joe Dispenza says exactly the same. Not intensity, but repetition. One of the deepest truths in this chapter is that there are no limitations to the mind except those we acknowledge. And from a tantric perspective, this becomes incredibly profound, because non-dual Shaiva Tantra ultimately teaches that your deepest nature is not insufficiency. It is consciousness itself, whole, complete, and unbounded in its creativity. The problem is not your essence. The problem is identification with limitation, identification with fear, with the conditioned self. Hill calls this lack of self-confidence. Tantra calls it anavamala, the impurity of individuality. Different languages, same recognition. Different language, same recognition. So, perhaps the real invitation of this chapter is not simply how do I become rich, but instead, what beliefs am I repeatedly energizing into reality? Because both poverty and riches begin first in consciousness. Both fear and freedom begin first in consciousness. And eventually, life starts reflecting back the identity we consistently rehearse. So, an invitation to you to gain more perspective on what it is you're actually rehearsing. To notice the stories you repeatedly tell yourself, that you emotionally reinforce, and to consider what's possible. To ask yourself honestly, is this conditioning creating the life I actually want? And if not, there is your opportunity to do something about it. And if you'd like support with that, head to the description. Men's Transformational Yoga is here to help. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next transmission. Cheers.